Hello and welcome back. Today we will discuss the emergence of modern mass society at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. In the second half of the 19th century, a technology-driven second industrial revolution sped up even further the rapid economic transformation of European and American countries. The gap between the industrialized and non-industrialized world grew faster and faster, further dividing the world along economic lines. Science and technology seemed intricately tied to the liberal idea of economic growth and progress. Yet by the end of the 19th century, liberalism and the idea of progress was coming under attack in the societies where it had triumphed, as lower-class men and women began to demand equal civil and political rights. We've already discussed the emergence of labor unions, modern mass political parties, and welfare legislation. Today, we will concentrate on the growing relevance of consumerism, mass media, and leisure activities in modern society. The growing influence of the lower classes in the economic and social model of modern society inspired new critiques of economic and political liberalism, from philosophical criticisms of liberalism's inflexibility to a growing demand for gender equality. The rise of mass society just over 100 years ago laid the groundwork for the world we live in today. So let's get started. We'll look first at the growing influence of modern empirical science in establishing new conceptions of economic, political, and social structures. We will also consider how empirical research and objectivism was manipulated by pseudoscientists in order to perpetuate long-established social and cultural biases, such as racism and gender discrimination. Let's start by looking at the economic developments that contributed to the emergence of mass society. A major contribution would have to be the continued economic development of European and North American countries through the end of the 19th century. After 1870 especially, a second industrial revolution, which was characterized by the development of steel, petroleum oil, and electricity, made it very clear that economic development in the modern world was very much so technology-driven. Science and progress were intimately related. The United States and Germany best understood this and soon became world economic leaders, dethroning Great Britain from the position it had held for nearly 100 years. The connection of scientific thought with economic development was best reflected by positivist philosophical thought. Positivism argued that humans could come to understand everything, whether economic, political, or social in form, through the application of scientific research. Auguste Comte, who is credited as the father of positivist thought, believed that while humans only controlled a small part of the natural world, the study of science would reveal the unknown, the objective reality, that would grant humans increased knowledge and, by extension, increased control over nature. Science, then, was the key to improving human society. One of the most relevant scientists of the 19th century was Charles Darwin. In his 1859 book, The Origin of Species, Darwin laid out the basis of his theory of evolution, which argued that all animals change over time through a process of adaptation to their environment. Life in nature, he argued, was a constant struggle for survival, a struggle that only the fittest animals would survive. A lizard lives in deserts as opposed to the North Pole because it is best prepared to survive in hot, arid climates. The polar bear, however, does best in cold climates. Within each species, certain genetic characteristics make some animals better than others, and hence will ensure that they survive. A polar bear that does not swim fast enough will not catch as many fish as a faster bear, and as such has less of a chance to survive. This ensures that only the fittest pass on their genes to the next generation, improving ever so slightly the ability of the species to survive. Darwin applied his theory of evolution to humans in 1873 with the publication of his Descent of Man. Evolution and not creation, he argued, was the origin of humanity on Earth. Humans descended from other animals through a process of what Darwin called adaptive radiation. Here you have a contemporary cartoon of Darwin, which, as you can see, is mocking evolutionary theory. Darwin's scientific research was difficult for most to accept in the late 19th century. Heavily influenced by religion, the general population across the world tended to reject evolutionary theory. Darwin's ideas directly challenged the creationist argument that the world had been created by a god, usually in a matter of a few days. In the United States, the criticism of Darwin's ideas reached the educational system, where in 1925, John Scopes, a teacher in a Tennessee public school, was put on trial for teaching evolutionary theory to his students. The state had a law banning the teaching of such theories. The Scopes monkey trial, as it came to be known, was eventually dismissed, but it had revealed the growing tensions between religion and science in American society, tensions that continue today. You have here a couple of cartoons mocking the Darwinian idea that humans derive from simians. Yet, even though Darwin's ideas would not take hold in the classroom for many years, they immediately found followers in other areas. Herbert Spencer, author of the book Social Statics, applied Darwin's evolutionary theories to economics and society, giving birth to what came to be known as social Darwinism. Spencer applied the idea of the survival of the fittest to capitalist economics and society. Competition in the laissez-faire market, Spencer argued, incited a natural selection of the best prepared to survive, leaving the unprepared to perish. If a store did not actively compete with other stores in the neighborhood, sales would drop and eventually the owner would be forced to close the store. The stores that survived carried with them successful economic genes, lifting the business world to a higher plane. This, Spencer argued, was the source of progress in modern society. Though not based on any serious scientific research, Spencer's ideas became quite popular and are still influential today. As social Darwinism spread beyond the boundaries of economic theory, it began to influence social thought. One of the most negative offshoots of social Darwinism was the eugenics movement. Parting from the belief that human behavior was determined by genes, eugenics suggested that criminality, antisocial behavior, and even mental illness depended on heredity. Controlling the genetic makeup of society, then, would reduce the incidence of these social diseases. Once again, this belief was not founded in serious scientific research. Darwin himself did not agree with this misinterpretation and manipulation of his actual scientific work. However, the lack of scientific rigor in the 19th century allowed such unfounded pseudo-scientific claims to grow in popularity. In 1883, for example, Francis Galton founded the American Eugenics Movement, which became quite influential in the United States, encouraging state and federal governments to adopt compulsory sterilization of U.S. citizens considered genetically inferior. Between 1900 and 1960, a total of 35 states sterilized over 60,000 people. As you might imagine, ethnic minorities were most often targeted for sterilization. The image on this slide is a photograph taken in a U.S. clinic in the 1930s advocating the control of hereditarily inferior people. The announcement on the left, you can see, reads, "Some people are born to be a burden on the rest." And on the right, you can see it says, "Learn about heredity. You can help to correct these conditions." The growing popularity of social Darwinism was inspired in part by the rapid increase in population that characterized the 19th century. Throughout the industrialized world, improved farm and factory production and growing distribution networks increased food availability, which combined with new medical discoveries increased birth rates while decreasing death rates. For the first time in history, the European and North American population grew significantly. British population, for example, doubled between 1850 and 1900 in only 50 years. Germany grew by 50% in the same period, from about 40 million to about 60 million. The rapid growth of population brought with it new social and cultural trends that changed the social and political face of society. The most notable effect of the population boom of the 19th century was the rapid growth of cities. Here you have, as an example, images of Chicago in 1820, that's on the top left, 1859 on the right, and 1898 on the bottom. You can see how dramatically the city changed in less than 100 years. It was in the increasingly densely packed neighborhoods of these cities that social interaction and relationships first began to change. Urban massification was made possible by the developments of the late 19th century. Street lighting and sewer systems, like what you see here in these images in Berlin and in Paris, brought greater comfort to urban living and made possible the expansion of larger and larger cities. By the late 19th century, the conditions of the working class that Friedrich Engels had denounced in 1845 were improving somewhat. Labor reform legislation had raised salaries and reduced working hours. With more money in their pockets and more time with which to spend it, the growing number of industrial workers living in these expanding cities wanted products to spend their money on. Consumerist culture spread to the working class. Newly formed manufacturing corporations began to actively target the working class, expanding exponentially their market share. Shopping had become popular. The first modern malls emerged at this time. Based in design on the traditional bazaars of the Middle East, new shopping passages or arcades sprouted up in all industrialized countries. The Sears Roebuck catalog became all the rage at the turn of the century. Even if one lived in the far reaches of the backcountry, with an envelope and a stamp, one could shop for the same products available in the large cities of Chicago or New York. Advertising and marketing became an integral part of this new consumerism. Newspapers soon filled with advertisements for anything from clothing to horse saddles. The invention of the radio by the Italian Marconi, you can see him in this picture here, at the end of the 19th century provided another avenue of advertisement. The famous Eiffel Tower was funded early on by the placement of a radio antenna at its top. Starting in the 1920s, the tower would serve as a large advertising billboard. At night, it would light up with the word Citroën, as you can see here, the name of a rising automobile manufacturing company in France. More free time meant more leisure time as well. The end of the 19th century saw the birth of most modern sports that are played today. Basketball, cycling, baseball, rugby, and football, or soccer as it is called in the United States, were all invented in this period. Exercise was the initial reason to practice these new sports. They provided an escape from the tight living quarters of the city. They were also a new way to associate with other like-minded people. The invention at the turn of the century of cinema provided another new leisurely activity. Moving pictures, as they initially were named, quickly became very popular. They brought the world to the movie theater, allowing viewers to travel to faraway lands and to see faraway peoples. They could also transport viewers to past times or to the future. But movies also reflected popular realities and beliefs. One of the first full-length movies released in the U.S. in 1903 was entitled The Birth of a Nation, and it reflected the racist overtones of American society at the time, as can be seen in the image below, where you can see hooded KKK members that are about to hang an African-American man for having an affair with a white woman. Note, interestingly enough, that the actor interpreting the African-American is actually a white man wearing dark makeup. There were also movies that reflected the economic and social difficulties of the time, such as the comedies portrayed by Charles Chaplin, which were set in poor neighborhoods of cities. Westerns also became a favored film genre. I've included for your viewing pleasure a poster from the movie Writing Romance. If you look closely, you can see that the film protagonist, played by Al Hoxie, is a, quote, devil with the ladies and hell on bad men. Industrialization had a great impact on another popular leisurely activity of the late 19th century, having a drink at the bar or cafe. Mass production cut the cost of alcoholic beverages, making them accessible to all social classes. Bars had always been popular, but now they really came to represent different social and political groups and interests. Bars provided an escape from the realities of urban life, but they also served as gathering places for the increasingly popular social clubs. They, in fact, also became impromptu political debating arenas. Many insurgent groups of the period, whether socialists, communists, anarchists, met secretly in bars or cafes, where it was easy for them to remain unnoticed. Women also partook in this associationist culture, though in a more restricted manner. Due to the moral impropriety of consuming alcohol, women typically met in cafes, where they drank hot chocolate or coffee instead. On this slide, you see examples of cafe culture in Paris on the left. You can also see a picture of the still open McSorley's Ale House in Lower Manhattan, here on the right, top right. Women were not allowed entrance into the bar until 1973, I believe. Anyway, at the bottom you see a drawing of the infamous Haymarket Affair, a riot that broke out in Chicago in 1886 as police fired on a group of workers that had been meeting in a neighborhood bar. The growing prominence that we've seen of the masses in modern society incited a reconsideration of the positivist philosophical thought and its argument that the world was scientifically exact and unchanging. A new philosophical movement emerged called modernism, which affirmed the power of human beings to make, improve, and reshape their environments. Modernism rejected established structures in society, culture, art, and even science. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche led the charge against positivism by challenging the notion that absolute truths existed. He argued against the 19th century obsession with finding universality, laws of nature and society that would apply to all equally. Nietzsche criticized universality as formulaic and static, denying any influence of individuals in the process. Instead, Nietzsche argued in favor of relativism, the acceptance of nuance, chaos, and uncertainty. In Nietzsche's mind, the context of every situation altered its outcome. He praised individualism and denounced mass society and its tendency to hegemony as mediocre. He rejected nationalism and socialism as constructed and not real. Society should be led, he argued, by Übermenschen, enlightened geniuses that understood through their free thinking the best direction for society. Authoritarian regimes during the 20th century, especially Nazi Germany, would use the Übermenschen concept to justify their controlling policies. But Nietzsche would have completely rejected the use of his ideas to manipulate mass politics. Sigmund Freud brought the concept of relativism to the study of psychology. He identified the strong influence exerted by the subconscious in the decision-making process. According to Freud, three relative elements influence our personalities: the rational ego, the irrational id, and the moralizing superego. These three are in constant conflict. He also subscribed to the interpretation of dreams and fantasies, especially sexual ones, as a gateway to the subconscious. Relativism also reached the sciences, where Albert Einstein developed the aptly named theory of relativity, which argues that the only constant in the universe is the speed of light. Everything else, including space, time, matter, and energy, is in constant flux. Just to give you an example, according to the theory of relativity, the faster one travels, the slower time passes. If we could take a long trip at the speed of light, we would age slower and return younger than those that we had left behind here on Earth. In art, relativism brought new deconstructive approaches best embodied by the Cubist movement and its best-known proponent, Pablo Picasso. Picasso's Cubist paintings portray subjects from all angles at once. Even though we are looking at the woman in the painting at the left from the front, we're also seeing the sides and back of her face. The point of view is relative and shows many different interpretations at once, emphasizing the complexity of life and the world around us. Even politics came to be influenced by relativism. The futurist movement, led by the Italian Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, was mainly an artistic movement, but it also developed political notions based on impulses and emotions, rather than structure and logic. Futurists were notorious for driving powerful cars at breakneck speeds in order to feel the primal rush of risking one's life. In some cases, they actually ran their cars into trees just to see what they would feel like. In the political realm, futurists believed in violence and destruction as passionate ways of solving political differences. They glorified war and masculinity. At the same time, They insisted in the subjugation of women. They did not gain any substantial political following, but their glorification of violence and destruction as a reason for living would strongly influence the emergence of authoritarian political movements such as fascism in the 1930s. It was in this context of intellectual and artistic challenge, of social and political universalism, that the women's suffrage movement arose at the end of the 19th century. Having been left out of every major political and social revolution since before the Enlightenment, women finally took the political stage, insisting on obtaining the right to vote. 19th century progress had clearly left women behind. As the century neared its end, men and women maintained separate spheres of sociability. As you can see here, women were expected to stay home, while men socialized in public. Male dominance was also patent in the legal system. Women were rarely allowed to own property. The American suffrage movement has its roots in abolitionism of the early 19th century. Many abolitionist activists were women, but were not allowed to partake in public rallies. Those that did found themselves booed off stage by men, and sometimes even women, that did not consider it proper for a woman to engage in politics. This was typically considered a man's realm. And so women such as Sojourner Truth and Susan B. Anthony, both pictured here, came to realize that while they struggled to gain equality for all men, they themselves were treated unequally. After the end of the Civil War, the women's suffrage movement began to take shape to right this wrong. In England, the suffrage movement became strongly militant. The suffragettes, as suffrage activists came to call themselves, took to the streets and engaged society directly with their demands for political equality. Emmeline Pankhurst, you can see her here on the right, the founder of the Women's Social and Political Union, insisted that political talk was not enough to bring about change. For Pankhurst, suffragettes needed to pursue deeds, not words. And so, to be heard, English suffragettes organized public demonstrations and even resorted to violence. They smashed windows in department stores and chained themselves to the gates of English Parliament. You see a group of suffragettes being cut loose from the gates in the photograph on the right. They also began blowing up railroad stations. The bombs were typically detonated in the early morning or late evening so as to avoid killing anyone. But there were cases in which the bombs exploded during the busy traffic hours, killing waiting commuters. Their most direct challenge to the established order was the bombing of the government Prime Minister David Lloyd George's weekend home. He was not in the building at the time, but various of his servants were injured in the explosion. The movement also had its martyrs. Emily Wilding Davison, who you see here on the left, took it upon herself to sabotage the National Derby Day, which was an annual horse race in which the King of England's horse competed. Emily's plan was to jump out in front of the King's horse as it came around the last bend, stop it, and hold a banner in favor of votes for women, making a strong statement for the suffragettes' cause. As you might imagine, the horse, which weighed close to 1,000 pounds, was too heavy for Emily to stop. As you can see in the picture on the right, the horse plowed through Emily, fracturing many bones in her body. She passed away 4 days later in a hospital. As demonstrations and violent acts increased in frequency, more and more suffragettes were arrested and ended up in jail. You can see on the right a suffragette being carried away by a police officer, with men yelling at her as she's dragged off. The destruction of property and the occasional death that accompanied suffragette activism led the English authorities to begin using the term terrorists to refer to suffragettes. The frictious relationship continued in jail, where many suffragettes would go on hunger strikes and protest. In the picture on the left, you can see a suffragette being force-fed with a rubber tube down her throat to keep her alive. Suffragette activism in the United States was not as violent as it was in England. However, public demonstrations, such as this march in Washington in 1913, were quite typical. Notice in the photograph women riding horses with one leg on each side of the horse, as opposed to what was considered the proper way for women to ride with both legs on one side. This was a clear challenge of gender stereotypes. I wanted you to see some examples of the portrayal of suffragettes in the mass media. On the left you have a pro-suffrage poster which asks for votes for women. Notice the self-assured woman wearing white, symbolizing purity I would say, and standing on a hill, symbolizing nature. On the right, you see a different vision of suffragettes. They are portrayed as violent and criminal elements. You can read at the bottom of the image, "Jump on him, he is only a mere man," in reference to the lack of respect suffragettes were supposed to have for the established order and male dominance. Here you have two more examples. On the left, you see a poster against women's suffrage. It shows a man returning home, as it says across the bottom, after a hard day's work. He finds his house a mess, the dirty laundry is strewn about, and his children are face down, crying. On the wall, there's a poster asking for votes for women, with a small note which you can't read from here, but which says, "Be back in a while." The suffragette, who's not even in the poster, is portrayed as irresponsible and selfish. On the right, we see the other side of the coin. Across the top, you get a listing of professions and positions that a woman could hold without having the vote. They range from mayor to doctor to mother. On the bottom, you see what a man can be without losing the vote. From lunatic to drunkard to convict, these men could still vote. As passionate and embittered as the issue of women's suffrage became in the early 1900s, women would not obtain the vote in England and the United States until after World War I. The intensity of the fighting during the war left factories in both countries without men to man the machines. Women took over the roles of men in the weapons and munitions factories and proved critical to the eventual victory in the war, helping maintain the front well supplied with arms and ammunition. Their position in the workplace doing men's jobs combined with years of activism to finally convince the governments of England and the United States to pass legislation giving women the right to vote. It had taken close to 150 years since the Declaration of Independence and over 50 years since the abolition of slavery in the United States for women to finally gain the right to vote. Gender stereotypes continued to pervade U.S. society, but after 1920, American women had the right to vote and could influence their future at the ballot box. Slowly, the ideas of equality and democracy that had identified the Enlightenment were becoming a reality for all of society.